creates an even bigger shortfall than we were faced with before. And it's not that it creates a bigger shortfall. So that creates a persistent shortfall. We can see that instead of this coming down to about $12,000 per year once their Social Security benefits kicked on, it persists at about, call it almost $70,000 per year. It does jump up here to $90,000, and that's because we've used all of the assets they've already paid tax on. We've used them all, and now we're using 401k and IRA money, and we have to pay tax, so her expenses go up, and that creates a bigger shortfall, which is why this is $90,000. And then we can see it gets lower out here in the future. Likely that's because a home got paid off, a liability is no longer being paid for, and that will reduce your annual expenses. It will also reduce your need to take more from your 401k and IRAs, so your tax is less. And so she's also starting, RMDs at that age as well. And so there's a combination of a few things happening there, and it makes the annual shortfall look smaller. Let's take a look at the withdrawals to see if we can sustain the withdrawal rate. So we can see we persist at that $60,000, almost $70,000 per year, and that happens through many of years up into $89,000, which I pointed out earlier. So we're at about 3.15 before his death, and even after his death, it's not that bad. We get to about 4.25% down here when we start making distributions from the taxable money. And that persists for a while until the house is paid off. We go back down to about 3 to 3.5. We get through to 4 at about 4 up here later on in retirement. But this is still a viable plan. Again, we were doing about 3.89, but she's got plenty of assets to cover that shortfall throughout the rest of retirement. So we can see, even if the client was to have a premature death at the age 65, and we lose about $80,000 or so worth of his income, the client, the surviving spouse, could still have a successful retirement because, their shortfall against the assets is only about 3.5 to 4% throughout retirement, which is sustainable. I'm going to jump back now to Monte Carlo with that same plan to see if we include the market's natural flow, if the client can still make it through. So we're back here in Monte Carlo, and I've already explained quite a bit of this to you guys earlier, so I won't redefine what Monte Carlo is. And we're going to make sure the plan is updated to Mr. Client's premature death, and sure we've got it. And it looks like, once again, we've got a 100% probability of success. So if the client does have a premature death, they're still in a good place. The question that comes after is, what if we layer in another retirement risk? And for this one, I'm going to go with long-term care. Now, for those of you who don't know, long-term care for men on average costs about $300,000 over, call it about 3 years. And for women, it's close to $500,000 because they tend to live a little longer over about a 4-year period. So I've pre-built a plan to save us some time here. Mr. Client premature death plus Miss Client long-term care. So he will have died at 65, and she'll have a long-term care need at some point in the future. Now let's look at the details for that long-term care need. So I'm running it for age 70. Again, it's likely that you'll have a long-term care need about the age of 80, but we want to be conservative in our planning. And then I'm setting it for a duration equal to 8 years instead of the average 4 years. That's because the client shared with us that her family had cognitive degenerative disease that went on for 8 to 12 years or so. So I'm setting it here at 8 on the low side at $100,000 per year. That's a semi-private room in a nursing facility, the average cost, at about 2.44%. That's for inflation, because those medical costs will become greater and greater as time goes on. So looking at reports, if we jump back to the cash flow statement and we open up that plan, right here from our little cheat sheet, we can see that this is a failing plan. Let's dive in to learn a little more. So here we have the client passing away. This first gray line here is premature death of Mr. Client. Now we know that the shortfall persists because of that. It stays about $65,000, almost $70,000 per year. But what we're interested in here is this second gray line. That's age 70 for the client and when her long-term care need begins. So her expenses go from about $90,000 per year up to almost $250,000. Let's go ahead and jump to expenses to see what's taking place. So looking at expenses, there's a few things working against the client here. And the first is that her living expenses stay about the same. But the issue is the healthcare expenses. So they've grown to about $133,000 per year. That's from a base of 100K. 33,000 is inflation. So $133,500 for the cost of long-term care, growing over those 10 years. And then we have taxes. We were at 21K the year before, and that jumps quite a bit because she's needing more out of her 401Ks and IRAs, the money she hasn't paid tax on yet. So her taxes will go up. Now, getting back to the cash flow statement, this client will continue that large shortfall, and that being taken from her assets here, so we can see the assets depleting quickly for 10 years, and she gets lucky because, well, call it luck if you want, but the heirs, I guess, are the ones with luck because the client was scheduled to run out of money. She had about 3 years left here. It's about 200K a year taken from that remaining balance of 761. She happens to pass away, and in the 11th year, even though it shows a shortfall here, this balance is what's going to be passed to the heirs. She dies with about $750,000 left in her retirement savings accounts. Now, again, if that cost was to go on, say instead we change it from an 8-year duration to 10 or even 11 years, the client would have depleted all of their assets. Nothing would have been left for the beneficiaries at that time, but more importantly, that client's care would have to be taken over by one of her surviving, her kids, or one of her heirs would have to take on the responsibility for care for the client or to pay for the client's care. So looking at Monte Carlo for this plan, we have a 51% chance of probability. Now that's a little misleading because we could see that the plan just continues after her death, making distributions of her shortfall from her retirement savings accounts. What would end up happening is those would be passed on to the heirs, and then the heirs will have two options. They can lump sum it and pay all the tax up front, or they can take it over 10 years and reduce that tax burden. But the point to be made here is that if the client was to continue in that long-term care need, that her probability of success wouldn't actually even be 51%, it would be mostly zero. And that's because the market could never keep up, based on their assets, that 2 million or so, could never generate the type of return needed in order to sustain a $250,000 annual withdrawal. So that's how you go from a very promising retirement plan to one that ultimately fails. By introducing or layering on multiple retirement risk, you will find out whether or not a plan is built to succeed or fail. In this case, we see that if the client has a premature death and a long-term care need, then the plan ultimately fails. Now, we could take it one step further and layer on market downside, where the client could lose some of those assets in the first few years of, say, when they start that long-term care need. And so they won't make it through that full 8 years. They may make it for 4 or 5 or 6. It just depends on how many negative returns and the size of those negative returns. So hopefully the big takeaway from today's episode was that you guys should have a plan built and stress tested against the common risk of retirement. We're talking taxes, inflation, extended medical care cost, and even bear markets. If you need help putting together or building a plan, you guys are more than welcome to reach out to us via phone, email, and you can find those details attached to this marketing video. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and definitely wishing you the best of retirement.